Recently, I came across a magnificent paraphrasing of the laws of thermodynamics by a mathematical biologist who also happens to be a friend, fellow called Stuart Kauffman. And he said, you see, the trouble with you guys is you don't really understand complexity. So let me explain the laws of thermodynamics to you. And he said, this is how I state it. 1, you can't win. 2, you can't break even. 3, the rules of the game keep changing. 4, you can't leave the game, you have to play. That is the situation we are in. Now the question you'll ask is, so what? What can I do to address this kind of a problem? Because that's what you have to address. Even in a little way, no matter what job you do, you'll be dealing with others, you'll be dealing with customers, you'll be dealing with users, etc., investors, so on and so forth. And basically, I'd like to suggest that you think in 3 terms to address this issue. The first, for the lack of a nicer word to describe it, would be how to read the signs of what is going on in a system. I call it curating rather than searching, because curating means that you are using a combination of curiosity and understanding of the subject so that you can build a framework that suggests what you should be looking for. It means that you take knowledge as it stands and synthesize it to understand where you can build on it and take it forward. It means you look at it in a system sense rather than go reductionist and try to simplify it and face the consequences of it. And sometimes you need a sort of a zoom lens to go back and forth between a telescope and a microscope. And a Nobel laureate who headed the Pasteur Institute, a fellow called Joel de Rosnay, came up with a magnificent book called The Macroscope, where he said the problem is that we are either down in the details, which is the microscope, or far away in space, which is the telescope. One gives us an overview and a system understanding, the other gives us the nitty-gritty, but we don't go back and forth. And he said what we need is a macroscope that helps us to go back and forth. And that's one of the more powerful tools when we do system understanding, is to really try and go back and forth to get a perspective on your problem. Curating is very different from merely searching and Googling for things. It means synthesis. It means looking at it in meta terms of what are you really doing, what are you really trying to understand. It becomes interdisciplinary, and you are focusing on wanting to be surprised rather than focusing on a few things, which is what I call, the delusion of not having peripheral vision. I've always wondered, having had the privilege of doing a bit of medicine, as to why close to 70% of our retinal cells in our eyes are not designed for focus, but are designed to look at the periphery. From an evolutionary point of view, it makes a lot of sense. If you did not catch the tiger coming out of the side, you didn't have to worry too much about focusing on anything. But today, 60% of our nerve power is used to see. 3.5 of your 12 cranial nerves just to move your eyes, 1 cranial nerve just to see, about 1/4 of your brain just to deconstruct what you're seeing. With all that emphasis, what does our education system do? You walk into kindergarten, ask, how many of you can draw? Every kid puts his hand up. By the time you come to high school, how many of you can draw? You're down to 3 or 4. If you're not lucky to be in architecture or engineering where you're forced to understand a little bit of drawing, you lose your visual thinking ability totally, which is hugely helpful in understanding complexity. and catching things in the periphery which are growing and will surprise you eventually. If you can catch it now instead of tomorrow, you have an advantage because you're reading the signs and you have a chance of beating the system. So first, curate. Second, with this kind of complexity, if you're not innovative, you don't stand a chance. So you have to be creative, which means you have to talk about imagining more, making connections which are not obvious, and trying to become creative. Now, some of you will say you don't become creative. You're either born creative or not born creative. Partly I understand. You might never end up being a Michelangelo or a Gauguin or some of those things. But I assure you, from hard practice, taking anywhere between the Secretary to the Government of India and a fisherman in Kasimedu, I can guarantee you that we can teach you creative problem solving and double and triple your creativity in understanding things, merely by things like shifting perceptions, looking at things differently, holding back on looking for an answer while you're searching for things, what we call diverging and converging. So the second aspect you worry about is being more creative. And the third aspect, which is a very, very important aspect, is when you're talking about uncertainty and complexity, you don't plan for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. I had a young friend of yours here who said that in about 20 years' time, I'd like to come back to India and join the government and work in the health ministry as an advisor. And my advice to him was, hold back on that because you don't know what will be here in 25 years. So what you do is you go into adaptive management where you learn from what you do, you tweak the system, you do a little bit, and you're continuously going through this embedded evaluation as you progress. Adaptive learning practically is the only way to really learn because you don't have the privilege of saying that 5 years from now, I shall guarantee food security in this country. The short answer to that is that's bullshit. The long answer, if you have a couple of hours, I can tell you about it. In complexity, we don't mess with these things. We learn to live with it, appreciate it, and work with it rather than try to control it and beat it. Next. The second type of approach to complexity is this awkward fact that we are reaching a stage when we need to work collectively or not at all. Let me give you a little example. I left the United Nations, took early retirement in the year 2000 after having worked for a long, long time in fisheries and forestry. 3 days after I retired from the UN, I got a call from the FAO asking me to come to Rome for 3 months because they had a crisis. Now, when I left the FAO, I had assumed that I would occasionally be picked up for assignments in fisheries and forestry. That's common sense because that's where my expertise was. To date, 13 years into retirement from the FAO, I've never had a fisheries assignment. But I've had hundreds of assignments on areas which had nothing to do with fisheries. It had to do with helping people to work together. And this came as a complete surprise to me because I assumed that the more educated you are, the higher you are up in the hierarchy of organizations, that this would come naturally to you. You would know how to work with each other. So why was the FAO calling me to Rome? They had an interagency activity which brought 5 agencies: UNDP, FAO, World Food Programme, DFID, and the World Bank. And they were going to take a fundamental shift of moving from an approach of welfare to an approach of livelihoods. And they had set up a joint team to figure out how to operationalize this. And for 6 months, all these people did was fight each other rather than do anything. So, when the Deputy Director General asked me to look into this, I said, why are you asking me? I have nothing to do with this subject. He said, no, it's got nothing to do with subject. He said, if you can make a bunch of fishermen work together, the chances are you can make these idiots work together. So I spent 3 months, and it actually worked. I'll tell you what it's called. It's called facilitation. Nowadays you can actually join an association of facilitators. You can get trained for it in a few places. But I learned all my facilitation on the beach from fishermen, because they would occasionally take me aside and said, look, we like you very much, we are very kind people, so we are humoring you, but would you like to get down to business and talk sense, or are you just going to behave like an idiot all the time? And I said, what are you talking about? He says, you make no sense to us. You don't understand us. You don't understand our problem. Why are you just, going round and round and pretending to be an expert? So I said, how would you suggest? He said, well, shut up and listen, and that could be a good beginning. And one of the best skills in facilitation is to learn to shut up and listen. Really listen. Empathize to the point that you understand people's feelings, not just what they are telling you. The second is to observe, because about 60% of what you're showing is body language. So no matter how good you are, unless you intend to only work on the internet or work on telephones, face to face, I don't care what you say, the people will catch what you're saying because your body will show it off. Unfortunately, we haven't figured it, except in a few cases, on how to control body language. You observe. It's a skill I would very, very strongly recommend, because I guarantee you, you will go to the top simply because you're the only one around who can get people to work together happily and productively. It's helping people to get into a situation, synthesizing for them, nudging them in the right direction, and watching them do the work rather than you telling them what to do. It works, and you see it in practice. And it works at every level, and I was amazed how necessary it is. I would have always thought that facilitation is necessary in maybe meetings amongst junior staff. Most of the facilitations I do these days are at the rank of directors and above, because they say we genuinely don't know how to work with each other. Because we have our own agendas, we have power, we have huge egos, we have differing perceptions. They guarantee that you can't work together because you're not even listening. In fact, walk into a meeting and listen to what we call a discussion. By the way, the word discussion, the roots come from the Greek to throw a discus. You go to meetings, you say what you want to say, which you have already decided, you listen to nobody. Which is why when you go to a conference, a person comes and says something, and 4 speakers after that say the same thing, instead of earning brownie points by saying, this guy said exactly what I want to say, thank you very much. You have the attention totally. People might forget what the points were that the other guy said. They'll never forget the fact that you walked away when everyone expected you to stay back and drone on. Please consider that. I'd also like to touch upon communication, because it's something all of us are very proud of and very few of us actually do. And I don't care whether it's verbal or written or visual. Because if you can't communicate what you know, as far as I'm concerned, you don't know it. I mean, it's nice to know that you think you know it, but if nobody else can figure out what you know, it's a bit of a shame, right? Please, think about communication. And by thinking about communication, I mean think about the person you want to communicate to, not who's doing the communicating. Because it's the other side who has to benefit from it. And there's a problem. Knowledge is almost impossible to transfer. It's such a unique thing and such a in-the-moment thing. I can give you information, I can give you data. I can't really give you knowledge because that you create on the spot when you have things. So I can't really transfer knowledge. I can nudge you into thinking. I can provoke you into thinking, and maybe you will move in the directions I want you to move. Where is the power in communications? Simple everyday communications. When I joined the FAO as the junior most person in the block, my boss said one of the traditions in this place is the junior most person keeps notes of every meeting. So I was stuck with keeping notes, which I hated, until I realized the power behind it. Because after some time, if you do a good job of it, and if you're brief, if you're strategic in your note taking, and you think about it, you find that other than the boss, you're perhaps the only person who has an overview of what's going on. You're the only person who has synthesized what everyone has said in real time. You know where the next step should be, who should do it. You're the obvious candidate when the boss drops dead. Think about it. The number of senior managers, directors, under-secretary generals, at least in the United Nations system, who started their careers as associate professional officers, laboriously taking minutes for 5 years, is unbelievable. Because they understood the power of being brief, strategic, to the point, and thinking about others rather than thinking about themselves when communicating. Please learn how to be brief. There's no challenge in writing an essay. Easy. But to put everything down on one side of one A4 sheet, which not only gives the background, the context, the issues, but what the spin-offs could be for a decision, that takes art. But the nice thing is it can be learned, and it's not rocket science. Think about it. Right. One last point, and then we can go to questions and answers. And this is going to be touchy, so I'm going to make it short. But I want you to just think about it. How the hell do you choose? It's like the old Alice in Wonderland question, when she came up to a fork in the road, and there was the Cheshire cat sitting on the tree. And Alice said, "Do you know which road I should take?" And the cat said, "Where do you want to go?" And she said, "I'm not sure." And he said, "Then it doesn't matter." You have to choose every stage. And sometimes those choices are tough choices. Why did I go from biomedical engineering to public health? Not because of divine direction or intelligence. I happened to be a research assistant to an ocular neurophysiologist at the University of Miami. And we were seriously trying to figure out how to read and analyze the movements of eyes while you're looking at things in real time. Why? Because he was trying to figure out how to cure a problem called nystagmus. You see people whose eyes flicker all the time. That's nystagmus.